So today we're going to do an adjustment of the 2017 wastegate on a set of factory turbos. If you'd like to replace turbos, you're going to do this same process to make sure your wastegate produces the correct voltage on your vehicle so that it does not throw an unhappy wrench on your dashboard. So step one, the turbos will look like this. You'll have two nuts on the shaft and your actuator arms for your housings. The first thing we want to do is take the nut and loosen it all the way to the end. Now that we have the nut all the way to the end, we don't want any threads showing so that when we push the shaft into the wastegate, we don't damage any threads. So now we're going to push the shaft back into the wastegate so that we can properly adjust it. Just hold the turbo when you do this. So that is all the way in. So now we want to remove the nut for the next very important part of the adjustment. You'll notice the wastegate itself, this is full open, this is full closed. You want to adjust the wastegate in the full closed position because the shaft is all the way in the wastegate. When you put the arm on the shaft, you'll notice a certain amount of threads that will show on the shaft. You're ideally looking for just enough to thread the nut flush with the arm and maybe just leave a couple of tiny threads showing. This is the most important part of the adjustment. If you do not do this the correct way, when you adjust it, you'll either have no threads like this, which may be the case if you just bought a brand new turbo. Obviously you can't put a nut on that right there because there's no threads. Or worst case scenario, it goes too far and when you pull your adjusting rod, it hits the actual arm, so you won't get your full revolutions. Now I'm going to show you both just so that you're aware of how it should and shouldn't look. For the demonstration of the video, this is the last bolt to loosen up. Obviously you would loosen all of these to get your proper shaft adjustment. So for example 1, if I rotate the compressor housing, it'll net a different result on the shaft. So in this case, full closed on the wastegate leaves very little space between the shaft and the arm. This obviously is not adjusted correctly because there's not enough space on the shaft to accommodate for your adjustment. So we'll have to rotate the opposite direction. When rotated too much the opposite direction, you can clearly see on the shaft there's no threads on the side of the arm for full closed. That's full closed. It's barely enough just to touch it. So what we want to do is adjust the compressor housing so that we find the sweet spot for adjustment. And I'll do that now. Now that we have found the sweet spot, as shown here, full closed, we have just enough threads to put our nut on and leave a couple of threads at the end. You need to re-torque all the bolts on your compressor housing. So next we need to put the arm on and then thread the nut. And if you see, the nut is threaded and there's only 2 small threads that show. What you want to do is thread this nut so that this arm doesn't have any play in it, but it's not too snug. Now that we've adjusted the arm so that there's barely any play, we're going to go ahead and make our adjustment. For the 2017 Plus Ecoboost, it calls for 6 complete revolutions of the screw and 4 flats. So 6 will mark, where'd my Sharpie at? So we'll start by marking 1 flat of the nut for our adjustment. In this case, I use my Sharpie because I love my Sharpies. So we mark the Sharpie, and of course, we mark our starting point. Now we're going to do our 6 complete turns so that the shaft pulls out of the wastegate towards the exhaust portion of the turbo. So the rod, as we tighten it, will move that direction. So here we're on 6. Now we want to go 4 flats. This would be 1 flat, this would be 2 flat, this would be 3 flat, and so on and so forth. We want to turn 4 flats. Now that we have our 4 flats, you could clearly see that at the end of the shaft there's space between the shaft and the arm, as demonstrated by something as simple as putting a screwdriver in there. There's space there. This is what we're looking for. When you get this done, you could snug down the nut on the opposite side to spec. So the reason we adjust the actuator rod is specifically for voltages on the vehicle. So you could see that the operating range, as shown in my diagram, is between 1.2 volts and 4.1 volts. If the truck senses voltages outside of these ranges, you'll get certain check engine lights. Specifically, one most common is range/performance, letting you know that the wastegate is outside of its optimal performance range. These voltages can be checked by using ForeScan in voltages by looking for the W gate B V volt or A volt. You should check both of these because if you swap 2 turbos, you will need to make sure that the voltages for both are correct. Referring to the diagram, you can check in voltage or percentage. If you have an N gauge, you can check using the PIDs labeled W gate A or B, DC mess, and this will show the actual percentage of where the shaft is at.